This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. Around 2 a.m., I noticed headlights appear in my rearview mirror. At first I was relieved to see another vehicle. The isolation of the empty road was starting to get to me. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the headlights weren't getting any closer or falling behind. They just stayed at the exact same distance, no matter how I varied my speed. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. I told myself I was being paranoid, lack of sleep making me imagine things, but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I sped up a bit, pushing my old Civic faster than I normally would. The headlights behind me sped up too, maintaining that same unnervingly consistent gap. My palms started to sweat as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I considered pulling over to let them pass, but something held me back. What if they pulled over too? I was alone out here in the middle of nowhere. Better to keep moving. As the road curved, I got my first real look at the vehicle behind me. It was a large pickup truck, jacked up on huge tires with a menacing-looking grille. In the moonlight, I could just make out a solitary figure in the driver's seat, but couldn't see any details. I started looking for any turn-offs or side roads, hoping to lose my pursuer. But there was nothing but empty fields stretching to the horizon. My gas gauge was getting low. I'd have to stop eventually. The thought made my stomach clench with fear. Suddenly the truck's high beams flicked on, filling my car with blazing white light. I flinched and swerved slightly, heart pounding. What did they want? Why were they toying with me like this? I fumbled for my phone, thinking to call for help, but of course there was no signal out here. I was on my own. The next hour was the longest of my life. The truck stayed glued to my back bumper, sometimes falling back a bit only to come roaring up close again. I went as fast as I dared on the twisting country roads, praying I wouldn't hit a deer or lose control. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, I saw a sign for an exit ahead. Without hesitating, I swerved onto the off-ramp at the last second. To my immense relief, the truck sailed past, continuing down the highway. I pulled into a 24-hour gas station, hands shaking as I filled up my tank. As the first hints of dawn started to lighten the sky, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just an impatient driver, not an hours-long pursuit. I almost managed to convince myself, but as I walked out of the station with a much-needed coffee, my blood ran cold. There, across the street, was the truck. It was parked facing me, headlights off, but I could see the silhouette of the driver watching me. I dove into my car and peeled out of there, tires squealing. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every vehicle I saw made me flinch. I took back roads and detours, trying to shake any pursuit. By nightfall, I was in a small town, too tired to drive anymore. I got a motel room but barely slept, jumping at every sound. In the morning light, everything seemed less menacing. I almost felt silly for getting so worked up. I decided to continue my trip, telling myself it was all just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by my tired mind. As I packed up my car, I noticed an envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It showed me sleeping in my motel room, taken through the window. I left town immediately, driving aimlessly, too afraid to stick to my original route. For days I wandered, taking obscure back roads, never staying in one place for long. I'd catch glimpses of that truck in my mirrors, always at a distance, but unmistakable. Sometimes it would disappear for hours, only to show up again when I least expected it. One night, I ended up on a dirt road deep in a national forest. My nerves were shot from days of cat and mouse. As I rounded a bend, my headlights illuminated the truck parked sideways, blocking the narrow road. I slammed on my brakes, skidding in the loose gravel. Heart pounding, I threw the car into reverse. But before I could move, the truck's door opened. A tall figure stepped out, face hidden in shadow. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or think. The figure slowly walked towards my car. I fumbled for the lock, but my hands were shaking too badly. As they approached my window, I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. There was a light tap on the glass. Somehow, I found the courage to look. The figure was holding up a piece of paper with something written on it. Squinting in the dim light, I made out 4 words. "You forgot your wallet." Confused, I patted my pocket. My wallet was indeed missing. With shaking hands, I cracked the window. The figure silently handed me my wallet, then turned and walked back to their truck. They drove off into the night without another word, leaving me sitting there in shock. I never saw the truck again after that night. To this day, I have no idea who was driving or why they followed me for so long just to return my wallet. I must have dropped it at that first gas station without realizing. But how did they know who I was or where I was going? Why the days of pursuit and fear? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll come across that Polaroid tucked away in a drawer, and the fear comes rushing back. I don't take solo road trips anymore, and I always triple check that I have my wallet before leaving home. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed the abandoned car on the side of the road. At first I didn't think much of it, probably just someone who had broken down and gotten a tow. But as I got closer, something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The car was pulled off onto the shoulder, driver's side door wide open. No hazard lights flashing, no sign of anyone around. Just an empty vehicle sitting there in the pitch-black night. I slowed down as I approached, craning my neck to get a better look. That's when I saw the smear of what looked like blood on the driver's side window. My heart started racing. Should I stop? Keep driving? Call the police? Before I could decide, my headlights illuminated a figure standing about 20 feet in front of the car. A man, tall and lean, just standing there motionless in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes, tires screeching as I skidded to a stop about 10 feet from him. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through my windshield. He was dressed all in black, face hidden in shadow. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand and beckoned me to come closer. Every instinct screamed at me to floor it and get the hell out of there. But some morbid curiosity made me inch the car forward, heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The man's clothes were ragged and torn. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and wild, and his hand, oh God, his hand was covered in blood. I don't know what snapped me out of it, maybe a flicker of movement as he started to reach for my door handle. But suddenly, I was shifting into reverse, tires spinning as I whipped the car around in a frantic U-turn. I caught one last glimpse of the man in my rearview mirror. He hadn't moved, just stood there watching me speed away. I drove like a madman, pushing my old sedan to its limits as I raced down the empty highway. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. Every few seconds, I'd glance in the rear view, terrified I'd see headlights gaining on me. After about 15 minutes of seeing nothing but darkness behind me, I started to relax a little. My breathing slowed, and I eased up on the gas pedal. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for what I'd seen. That's when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, they were just pinpricks in the distance, but they were gaining on me fast, way too fast. My panic came rushing back as I realized it had to be the abandoned car. How had they caught up so quickly? I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, pushing my car as fast as it would go. The headlights kept getting closer. Soon I could make out the outline of a large vehicle, maybe an SUV or truck. It was right on my bumper now, so close I couldn't even see the headlights anymore in my mirrors. I swerved back and forth, trying desperately to shake them. But they matched my every move. Just when I thought they were going to ram me off the road, I spotted a brightly lit gas station up ahead. I yanked the wheel hard, screeching into the parking lot and skidding to a stop right in front of the doors. I scrambled out of the car and ran inside, yelling for the attendant to call the police. Heart racing, I spun around to look back outside, expecting to see the vehicle that had been chasing me. But there was nothing there, just empty darkness beyond the bright lights of the gas station. I stood there panting, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I gave them a report of what happened, feeling more and more foolish as I recounted the bizarre events. They took down all the details and said they'd send a car to check out the abandoned vehicle. But I could tell from their expressions that they didn't really believe me. I ended up getting a room at a motel down the road, too shaken to continue driving that night. Sleep was impossible. I kept replaying everything in my mind, questioning what I'd really seen. Had it all been some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue? Or was there something sinister out there on that lonely stretch of highway? The next morning, I called the police station to follow up. They told me they had sent a car out, but found no sign of an abandoned vehicle or any evidence of foul play. The officer I spoke to gently suggested that perhaps I had been more tired than I realized, and my mind had played tricks on me. I tried to put it behind me as I got back on the road to continue my trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every vehicle I passed made me tense up. Every distant glint of light in my mirrors sent a spike of fear through me. It's been months now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. Sometimes I manage to convince myself it was all just an exhaustion-induced fantasy. But then I'll catch a glimpse of someone tall and lean dressed in black, or I'll see an abandoned car on the side of the road, and that paralyzing terror comes rushing back. I don't drive long distances at night anymore if I can help it. When I have to, I stick to well-traveled roads and always make sure my gas tank is full. I keep my doors locked and never stop for anyone. Some might call me paranoid, but they weren't there. They didn't see what I saw. I know it sounds crazy. Hell, most days I think I'm crazy for still obsessing over it. But I can't shake the feeling that something was out there that night. Something dangerous. Something hungry. And I was lucky to escape with my life. So if you're ever driving down a dark, lonely stretch of highway in the middle of the night, and you see an abandoned car on the side of the road, don't stop. Don't slow down. Just keep driving and don't look back, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the darkness. I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced I can hear the rumble of an engine outside my window. In my dreams, I'm back on that highway, but this time I can't get away. The headlights keep getting closer and closer until they consume everything. I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but it's hard to explain the sheer terror of that experience to someone who wasn't there. They always want to rationalize it, find some logical explanation. But how do you explain the inexplicable? I've done research, trying to find similar stories or reports from that area. But there's nothing concrete, just vague urban legends and campfire tales. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one who's encountered whatever is out there. Or maybe others have, but didn't live to tell about it. The worst part is the not knowing. Not knowing what would have happened if I had stopped to help. Not knowing who that man was or what he wanted. Not knowing if I'm still in danger somehow. I've thought about going back, trying to find that stretch of highway again. But every time I consider it, a primal fear grips me. What if it's still out there, waiting? What if this time I don't get away? So I stay away from lonely roads now. I stick to the highways, the well-lit streets, the places where other people are always around. But even surrounded by the noise and bustle of the city, I can't forget. In quiet moments, I can still hear the sound of tires on asphalt, still feel the terror of being pursued by something I couldn't see or understand. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened that night. It's changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. But I'm alive. I survived. And maybe by sharing my story, I can help someone else avoid the terror I experienced. So remember, if you're ever driving late at night and you see something strange on the side of the road, trust your instincts. Don't let curiosity overcome your common sense, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some dangers are best left unanswered. Stay safe out there on the open road. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness beyond your headlights. I was about 2 weeks into my solo Pacific Crest Trail hike when it happened. The isolation and natural beauty had been everything I'd hoped for, a much-needed reset after a tough year. I'd seen some incredible sights and pushed my body to new limits, but nothing could have prepared me for that day. It started like any other on the trail. I woke up at dawn, broke down my tent, and hit the trail early to beat the heat. The terrain that day was challenging, lots of elevation changes through dense forest. By mid-afternoon, my legs were burning and I was ready for a break. That's when I spotted the cabin. It was set back from the trail a bit, partially hidden by trees. Normally, I wouldn't trespass, but something about it caught my attention. It looked long abandoned, with boards over the windows and moss growing on the roof. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I noticed newspapers and magazines strewn all over the porch. They were weathered and faded, but I could make out headlines about government conspiracies, alien cover-ups, that sort of thing. It was bizarre to see out here in the wilderness. I peered through a gap in the boards, trying to see inside. Suddenly I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around and my heart nearly stopped. There was a man standing there, wild-eyed and unkempt, pointing a shotgun directly at my chest. He looked like he'd been living rough for years, matted beard, tattered clothes. But the gun was definitely real. "Who are you? What agency sent you?" he snarled, taking a step closer. I put my hands up, trying to stay calm. "Whoa, easy there. I'm just a hiker, I don't mean any harm. I was just curious about the cabin." "Liar!" he spat. "I know they've been watching me, trying to silence me, but I know the truth." He was clearly delusional and extremely dangerous. I knew I had to get out of there fast. "Look, I'm sorry for trespassing. I'll leave right now and you'll never see me again, okay?" I started to back away slowly, hands still raised. For a moment I thought he might actually let me go. Then his eyes narrowed and he raised the gun higher. No, you know too much now. Can't let you report back." Time seemed to slow down. I saw his finger tightening on the trigger, and pure instinct took over. I dove to the side just as the gun went off with a deafening boom. The blast hit a tree behind where I'd been standing, showering me with splinters. I scrambled to my feet and took off running as fast as I could. I heard him cursing and crashing through the underbrush behind me. Another shot rang out, and I felt the wind of it passing close to my head. Pure adrenaline and terror propelled me forward. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face. I could hear him pursuing, moving surprisingly fast for an older guy. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't dare slow down. After what felt like an eternity, I realized I couldn't hear him behind me anymore. I risked a glance back and saw no sign of pursuit. Still, I kept running for another 10 minutes before I finally had to stop, gasping for air and on the verge of collapse. As I caught my breath, the reality of what just happened started to sink in. I'd nearly been murdered by some crazed hermit in the middle of nowhere. I was lost, having run off the trail in my panic, and I had no idea if he was still out there looking for me. I took stock of my situation. I still had my pack with supplies. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely operate my GPS, but I managed to figure out my location. To my immense relief, there was a ranger station about 5 miles away. I set off immediately, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every sound. It was nearly dark by the time I stumbled into the ranger station. I must have looked half crazy myself, wild-eyed and babbling about the man with the gun. The rangers were skeptical at first, but became more concerned as I recounted details of the encounter. They radioed for backup to investigate the area I described. I spent a sleepless night at the station, jumping at every sound. In the morning, they told me a team had searched but found no sign of the cabin or the man. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it all, but I knew deep down it had been real. That was the end of my PCT journey. I just couldn't bring myself to get back on the trail. Every rustle in the trees, every snapping twig sent me into a panic. The wilderness that had once felt so welcoming now seemed full of hidden dangers. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that day. I can't shake the image of that wild-eyed man and the gun pointed at my chest. I've tried to research if there have been any similar encounters in that area, but found nothing conclusive. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, hidden away in the forest with his paranoid delusions. Other times, I wonder if it was all some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. Either way, it's changed me. I used to love solo hiking and being alone in nature. Now I can't even go for a walk in the woods without feeling on edge. I know the odds of something like that happening again are astronomically low. But the fear is always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I still don't know what to make of it all. Was he some off-the-grid survivalist driven mad by isolation, a former government agent in hiding, or just a dangerously unhinged person who found the perfect place to indulge his paranoia? I'll probably never know for sure. All I know is that my dream of hiking the PCT turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. It taught me that even in the most beautiful and serene places, danger can be lurking just out of sight. I'm trying to work through the trauma and get back to the things I love. But I don't think I'll ever look at the wilderness quite the same way again. I was so excited for our camping trip in the Ozarks. My 3 best friends from college and I had been planning it for months, a chance to reconnect and enjoy nature before our senior year. We arrived at the campsite on a beautiful Friday afternoon in late summer. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. Birds chirped in the distance as we set up our tents and gathered wood for a fire. That first evening was perfect. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, sharing stories and laughs late into the night. I felt so at peace surrounded by my friends and the tranquil forest. If only I had known how quickly that peace would shatter. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike. The trail wound through dense woods, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the rolling Ozark Mountains. About 2 hours in, we stopped for a water break in a small clearing. That's when we heard the first gunshot. At first, we assumed it was just hunters, but then we heard shouting and more shots in rapid succession. It didn't sound like normal hunting. Curious and a bit uneasy, we crept towards the noise. Looking back, I wish we had just turned and run right then. But we were young and foolish. We peered through the trees and saw a horrifying scene. 3 men with rifles standing over what looked like a fresh deer carcass. But as we watched, they began cutting into it and pulling out small packages wrapped in plastic. My blood ran cold as I realized what we were witnessing. These weren't hunters. They were using the deer to smuggle drugs. I must have gasped or made some small sound, because suddenly one of the men whipped around and looked right at us. For a split second, our eyes met, and I saw the shock and rage on his face. Then he raised his rifle and fired. We scattered in panic, sprinting in different directions into the woods. I could hear shouting behind us as the men gave chase. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Branches whipped at my face as I ran blindly, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually I slowed, gasping for breath. The woods were eerily silent. I realized with horror that I had no idea where I was or where my friends were. I was completely lost and alone. Trying to calm my ragged breathing, I strained my ears for any sound of pursuit. In the distance, I heard a twig snap. My body went rigid with fear. Were the men still hunting us, or could it be one of my friends? I crouched behind a fallen log, hardly daring to breathe. The sound came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My muscles tensed, ready to bolt. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a tree about 20 feet away. I almost cried with relief when I recognized my friend Jake. He looked as terrified as I felt. We embraced quickly, both of us shaking. In hushed whispers, we tried to figure out what to do. We had no idea where we were or how to get back to our campsite. Our phones had no signal, and somewhere out there, armed and dangerous men were hunting us. Jake said he thought he had seen a dirt road while he was running. It was our best chance of finding help, or at least getting our bearings. Warily watching for any sign of movement, we set off in the direction he indicated. We walked for what felt like hours, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. The shadows lengthened as afternoon faded to evening. I was starting to lose hope when we finally spotted the road through the trees. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Just as we were about to step out of the forest, we heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. We dove back into the underbrush as a battered pickup truck came into view. My heart nearly stopped when I saw who was driving. It was two of the men from earlier. They were moving slowly, scanning the woods on either side of the road, hunting for us. Jake and I lay frozen, hardly daring to breathe as the truck crawled past our hiding spot. I could see the driver's face clearly. His eyes were cold and determined. He had a rifle propped against the seat beside him. Finally, the sound of the engine faded into the distance. We waited several more minutes to be sure they were gone before cautiously emerging. "We can't stay on the road," Jake whispered. "They'll spot us for sure." I nodded in agreement. We would have to continue through the woods, but at least now we had a reference point. We decided to follow the road from a distance, hoping it would eventually lead us to civilization. As we walked, the light faded quickly. Soon we were stumbling through near total darkness. Every shadow looked like a threat. More than once I thought I heard footsteps behind us, only to turn and see nothing. We had been walking for maybe an hour when we heard voices up ahead. Jake and I froze, straining to listen. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond a ridge to our right. Silently, we crept forward and peered over the top of the ridge. What we saw made my heart soar. It was our other two friends, huddled together near a small stream. They looked exhausted and terrified, but alive. We called out softly, and they nearly wept with relief when they saw us. We quickly filled each other in on what had happened since we separated. Lisa and Mike had managed to stick together during the initial chase. They had been hiding and moving cautiously ever since, too afraid to call out or search for help. Now reunited, we felt a small spark of hope, but we still had no idea where we were or how to get to safety, and we knew the men were still out there searching for us. We decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead us to a larger river or lake where we might find people. As we walked, we took turns keeping watch behind us. Every snapping twig or odd shadow had us freezing in terror. It was nearing midnight when we finally saw lights through the trees ahead. At first, we were wary. Could it be the men's camp? But as we got closer, we realized it was a small ranger station. Overwhelming relief washed over me. We were safe. We practically ran the last 100 yards to the station. The ranger on duty was shocked when we burst in, wild-eyed and disheveled. Between gasping breaths, we managed to explain what had happened. The ranger immediately radioed for backup and police support. Within an hour, the station was swarming with officers. We gave our statements, marked locations on maps, described the men and their truck. A massive manhunt was launched. Police and Forest Service teams combed the woods all night. By dawn, they had found our abandoned campsite and the location where we had witnessed the drug operation. It was mid-morning when we got the news. All three men had been apprehended trying to flee the area. A large quantity of drugs was recovered from their vehicle. We were overjoyed, but also utterly exhausted. The events of the past 24 hours felt surreal. Had we really witnessed a crime, been hunted through the woods, and helped catch dangerous drug smugglers? It took weeks for the reality to fully sink in. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about being chased through those dark woods. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go camping again, but I'm incredibly grateful that we all made it out alive and that those dangerous men were caught. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, but it also showed me how strong I could be when pushed to my limits. I'll never forget those harrowing hours in the Ozarks, or how close we came to a much darker fate. I was out on my usual weekend canoe trip in the Everglades, something I'd done countless times before. The swamp was my second home. I knew every creek and bayou like the back of my hand. Or so I thought. It was a humid Saturday morning when I set out, the air thick and heavy around me. I paddled lazily through the mangroves, enjoying the quiet solitude. A great blue heron watched me warily from a low-hanging branch. An alligator slid silently into the murky water as I passed. Just another day in paradise. I decided to explore a remote area I hadn't been to in a while, following a narrow channel deep into the heart of the swamp. The foliage grew denser, blocking out most of the sunlight. Mosquitoes swarmed around me in thick clouds. I swatted them away absently, lost in my own thoughts. That's when I heard it, a faint cry in the distance. At first I thought it was just a bird or animal, but then I heard it again. This time it sounded distinctly human. A chill ran down my spine despite the oppressive heat. I paused, straining my ears. There it was again, definitely a human voice, and it sounded distressed. My heart started racing. What the hell was going on out here? This area was completely uninhabited, miles from any settlements. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I paddled as quietly as possible toward the source of the sound. As I got closer, I could make out multiple voices, angry shouting mixed with frightened cries. I beached my canoe on a small mud flat and crept forward on foot. The voices were coming from just beyond a thick cluster of trees. I inched closer, using the vegetation for cover. What I saw when I peered through the leaves made my blood run cold. There was a makeshift camp set up in a small clearing, a few tents and a couple of old airboats. But it was the people that made me recoil in horror. A group of rough-looking men were gathered around, most of them armed, and huddled on the ground were at least a dozen people, men, women, even a few children. They were bound and gagged, terror evident in their eyes. My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was seeing. This was clearly some kind of human trafficking operation. I felt sick to my stomach. I had to do something, but what? I was alone and unarmed. These guys had guns and probably wouldn't hesitate to use them. I started to slowly back away, planning to get to my canoe and paddle like hell to the nearest town to alert the authorities. But in my haste, I stepped on a dry branch. The loud snap echoed through the quiet swamp. Everything seemed to freeze for a split second. Then one of the men shouted and pointed in my direction. Panic exploded in my chest. I turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face. I could hear shouting and pounding footsteps behind me. My lungs burned as I gasped for air in the humid atmosphere. I reached my canoe and shoved off, paddling furiously. The sound of airboat engines roaring to life spurred me to even greater speed. I knew these waterways better than anyone, but those airboats were fast. This was going to be close. I took every twist and turn I could think of, trying to lose them in the labyrinth of channels. The whine of the airboat engines seemed to be all around me. My arms ached from the frantic paddling. At one point, I heard a boat approaching fast from behind. I veered sharply into a tiny side channel, ducking low as bullets whizzed overhead. The airboat roared past, unable to make the tight turn. I kept going, pushing deeper into the most remote parts of the swamp, areas I knew the airboats couldn't access. But I also knew I was getting dangerously far from civilization. As night fell, I finally felt safe enough to pause and catch my breath. I was utterly lost in the darkness, surrounded by the chorus of frogs and insects. The adrenaline wore off and I started shaking uncontrollably as the reality of the situation sunk in. I was alone in the middle of the Everglades, being hunted by armed human traffickers. I had no food, no water, no way to call for help, and I had seen something I was never meant to see. These men would not stop until they found me. I spent a sleepless night huddled in my canoe, jumping at every sound. As the sky began to lighten, I knew I had to keep moving. But which way? I had no idea where I was anymore. I picked a direction and started paddling. Hour after hour I pushed on, my muscles screaming in protest. The sun beat down mercilessly. My mouth was parched, my lips cracked and bleeding. Twice I heard airboats in the distance and had to quickly hide, my heart pounding. They were still searching for me. How long could I keep this up? As the second day wore on, I was nearing my breaking point. The lack of water and food was taking its toll. I was weak and disoriented. Hopelessness started to set in. Maybe I should just give up. But then I saw something that made my heart soar. Power lines in the distance. I nearly cried with relief. Where there were power lines, there had to be people nearby. I paddled with renewed energy. An hour later, I finally emerged from the swamp into a small marina. I must have looked like a wild man, stumbling out of my canoe. The shocked expressions of the people at the dock told me as much. "Please," I croaked, my voice hoarse. "I need help. You have to call the police." The next few hours passed in a blur. I gulped down water and tried to coherently explain what had happened to the local sheriff. Soon state and federal authorities were involved. I described the location as best I could, marking it on maps. A massive operation was launched. Helicopters and airboats headed out into the swamp. I collapsed into an exhausted sleep at a local motel. Armed guards posted outside my door. I awoke the next day to amazing news. They had found the camp and arrested over a dozen traffickers. Even better, they managed to rescue all of the victims. My heart soared knowing those poor people were safe now. The investigators had a million questions for me. I told my story over and over, reliving those terrifying moments. They said I was lucky to be alive. I knew they were right. In the following weeks, the full scope of the trafficking ring was revealed. It had been operating for years, smuggling people through the Everglades. My accidental discovery had brought the whole thing crashing down. I was hailed as a hero, but I didn't feel like one. I was just a guy who stumbled into something horrible and managed not to die. Still, knowing those victims were free and reunited with their families helped ease the trauma of what I'd been through. I still go canoeing in the Everglades. I won't let fear rob me of the place I love. But I'm a lot more cautious now. And sometimes, when I'm out on those quiet waters, I remember those terrible days and shudder. The swamp holds many secrets. Some of them are better left undiscovered. We arrived at the campsite on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. Our kids, Emily, 14, and Jake, 10, were buzzing with excitement as we set up our tent and unpacked our gear. The scenery was breathtaking, towering red cliffs stretching as far as the eye could see, with the Colorado River snaking through the canyon below. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. It felt idyllic, like something out of a cheesy family movie. If only I'd known then how quickly our dream vacation would turn into a nightmare. I woke up in the middle of the night to strange noises outside the tent. At first, I thought it might be animals rummaging for food. But then I heard hushed voices and the distinct sound of zippers being opened. My heart began to race as I gently shook Tom awake. "Someone's going through our stuff," I whispered urgently. Tom's eyes widened as he listened. Without a word, he slowly unzipped the tent flap and peered out. What he saw made his face go pale. "There are 3 men ransacking our campsite," he whispered. "They're armed." Fear gripped me as I looked at our sleeping children. What if these men decided to come into our tent? What would they do to us? Tom's voice snapped me back to reality. "We need to get out of here, now." We woke Emily and Jake as quietly as possible, putting our fingers to our lips to keep them silent. I could see the confusion and fear in their eyes as we hurriedly stuffed some essentials into our day packs. Just as we were about to make our escape, a gruff voice called out, "Hey, What's going on in there? Tom's eyes met mine, filled with determination. Run, he mouthed. In an instant, we burst out of the tent. Tom charged at the nearest man, catching him off guard and knocking him to the ground. Go, he yelled to us. I'll hold them off. Grabbing the kids' hands, I sprinted away from the campsite and into the darkness. The sound of a scuffle behind us spurred me on, even as my heart ached at leaving Tom behind. We ran blindly along the trail, guided only by the faint moonlight. Emily was sobbing quietly, while Jake kept asking where Dad was. I had no answers, only the overwhelming need to get my children to safety. After what felt like hours of running and hiding, we paused to catch our breath behind a large boulder. That's when we heard footsteps approaching. I held my breath, praying it was Tom. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. I can hear you breathing, a menacing voice called out. Come out now, and maybe we won't hurt you. Emily whimpered, and I clamped my hand over her mouth. Jake was trembling against me. I felt utterly helpless, trapped between the rock and these dangerous men. Suddenly, there was a commotion and the sound of a scuffle. I heard grunts and the thud of fists connecting. Then, miraculously, I heard Tom's voice. Karen, kids, where are you? Relief flooded through me as I called back to him. Moments later, he rounded the boulder, looking battered but alive. We embraced tearfully before he urged us to keep moving. I managed to knock out 2 of them, Tom explained as we hurried along the trail. But the leader is still after us. We need to find help. As the sky began to lighten, we found ourselves on a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop. That's when we heard angry shouts behind us. The leader of the gang had caught up. Tom pushed us behind him as a burly man with a wild beard came into view. He was brandishing a knife, his eyes blazing with fury. You've cost me my score and my crew, he snarled. Now you're gonna pay. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As the man lunged forward, Tom sidestepped and grabbed his arm. They grappled dangerously close to the edge. I wanted to help, but I couldn't leave the kids unprotected. In a desperate move, Tom managed to twist the knife out of the man's grasp. It clattered to the ground near my feet. The attacker, enraged, charged at Tom with all his might. But Tom was ready. At the last second, he ducked and used the man's momentum to flip him over his shoulder. The attacker's eyes widened in shock as he lost his balance and tumbled over the edge of the cliff. We heard his scream fade as he fell. Tom stumbled back, looking as shocked as the rest of us at what had just happened. There was no time to process it, though. We need to keep moving, Tom said shakily. Find a ranger station or someone who can help. We pressed on, exhausted and traumatized, but driven by the need for safety. As the sun rose higher, the heat became oppressive. Our water was running low, and the kids were struggling to keep up. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any further, we spotted a building in the distance. As we got closer, I could have cried with relief when I saw the park ranger logo. We burst through the door, startling the 2 rangers inside. Please, I gasped. We need help. There are dangerous men after us. The rangers sprang into action, radioing for backup and medical assistance. They gave us water and energy bars as we recounted our harrowing ordeal. Within hours, a search team had apprehended the 2 men Tom had knocked out at our campsite. They found no trace of the leader who had fallen, and I tried not to think about his fate. As we were airlifted out of the canyon to receive medical attention, I held on to my family tightly. The reality of how close we'd come to losing everything hit me hard. It's been months since that terrifying day, but the memories still haunt us. We've been through therapy and are slowly healing, but I don't think any of us will ever look at the great outdoors the same way again. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those men outside our tent. Other times, I see Tom struggling on that cliff edge, and I relive the horror of nearly losing him. But then I look at my family, bruised but unbroken, and I'm filled with gratitude. We survived something unimaginable, and it's made us stronger. We don't take a single moment together for granted anymore. I still can't explain why those men targeted us or how we managed to escape, All I know is that on that day in the Grand Canyon, we stared into the abyss of human cruelty and came out the other side. It's an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone, but one that taught us the true meaning of family and survival. I was always fascinated by the rugged beauty of the Scottish Highlands, so when I finally got the chance to go on a solo hiking trip there last summer, I jumped at the opportunity. Little did I know that my peaceful nature excursion would turn into a terrifying ordeal that still haunts me to this day. It was early August, and I had been trekking through the Highlands for about a week, reveling in the stunning scenery and solitude. On this particular day, I was making my way along a remote trail, surrounded by mist-shrouded mountains and sweeping valleys. The weather was typical for the region, cool and damp, with a light drizzle falling intermittently. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I suddenly heard voices coming from up ahead. This struck me as odd, since I hadn't encountered another soul for days. Curious, I crept forward quietly to investigate. Through a gap in some bushes, I saw a group of men gathered in a small clearing. There were about 5 or 6 of them, all dressed in dark clothing and speaking in hushed tones. At first I assumed they were just fellow hikers taking a break, but as I listened to snippets of their conversation, a chill ran down my spine. They were discussing shipments, drop points, and evading customs. With a sinking feeling, I realized I had stumbled upon some kind of smuggling operation. I knew I needed to get out of there fast, but I was paralyzed with fear. Just as I was about to retreat, I accidentally stepped on a twig. The loud snap seemed to echo through the clearing. The men instantly fell silent and began looking around suspiciously. My heart pounding, I ducked behind a large boulder. I heard footsteps approaching my hiding spot. I could have sworn I heard something over here, a gruff voice said. Another man replied, "Well, check it out then, you idiot. We can't risk anyone discovering the operation." I held my breath as the footsteps grew closer. Just when I thought I was about to be discovered, a rabbit darted out from some nearby bushes. "Ah, it was just a bleedin' rabbit," the first man said. I heard them walking away, and I let out a silent sigh of relief. But I knew I wasn't in the clear yet. I had to get far away from here before they realized someone had overheard them. As quietly as I could, I began to inch away from my hiding spot. But in my haste, I accidentally dislodged some loose rocks, which went clattering down the hillside. "Oi, there's someone over there," a voice shouted. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet and took off running as fast as I could. I heard angry shouts behind me, followed by the sound of multiple people crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. I ran blindly through the rugged terrain, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. The only thing on my mind was escaping those men. I knew if they caught me, I'd likely never be seen or heard from again. As I sprinted across an open field, I heard a gunshot ring out. The bullet whizzed past my head, missing me by inches. That's when the true gravity of my situation hit me. These men were willing to kill to protect their illegal operation. Fueled by pure adrenaline and terror, I pushed myself to run even faster. Up ahead, I spotted a densely forested area. If I could make it there, I might have a chance of losing them among the trees. I practically threw myself into the forest, ducking and weaving between the trunks. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as I delved deeper into the woods. But I didn't dare slow down. I kept running until my legs felt like jelly and my lungs were on fire. Finally, I couldn't go any further. I collapsed behind a fallen log, trying desperately to catch my breath while staying as quiet as possible. For what felt like hours, I crouched there, straining my ears for any sign that the men were still searching for me. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost in the middle of the highlands, being hunted by dangerous criminals. I had no phone signal, limited supplies, and no idea which direction to go. For the first time in my life, I genuinely feared I might die out here. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped rapidly. I knew I needed to find shelter soon. In the fading light, I spotted what looked like the entrance to a small cave in a nearby hillside. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I made my way to the cave entrance, my muscles screaming in protest with every step. The cave was damp and chilly, but at least it provided some protection from the elements. I huddled in the back, wrapping my arms around myself to try and conserve body heat. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves outside made me flinch. I was convinced the smugglers would find me at any moment. I don't think I slept at all that night, too terrified to let my guard down. As the first light of dawn filtered into the cave, I knew I had to get moving. I had no idea if the men were still searching for me, but I couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. I cautiously emerged from the cave, my eyes darting around for any sign of danger. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird call. Taking a deep breath, I tried to get my bearings and figure out which direction to go. I remembered from my map that there was a small village about a day's hike to the east. If I could make it there, I could alert the authorities about what I'd seen. But getting there meant traversing more open ground where I'd be exposed. With no other choice, I set off in what I hoped was an easterly direction. I stuck to areas with more cover when possible, and frequently stopped to listen for any sounds of pursuit. Every step was nerve-wracking. I felt like I could be ambushed at any moment. After several tense hours of hiking, I crested a hill and my heart leapt. I could see the village in the distance. But my relief was short-lived. To reach the village, I'd have to cross a wide, open valley with no cover. I'd be completely exposed. I debated waiting until nightfall to make the crossing, but I was already weak from hunger and fatigue. I didn't know if I could last that long without food and water. Taking a deep breath, I made the decision to risk it. I half ran, half stumbled down the hillside towards the village, my eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. Every second felt like an eternity. I expected to hear shouts or gunshots at any moment. By some miracle, I made it across the valley without incident. As I staggered into the village, several locals stopped to stare at my haggard appearance. I must have looked like a madman, wild-eyed and disheveled. I managed to convey that I needed to speak to the police urgently. A kind elderly woman led me to the local constable's office. As soon as I saw the officer, the floodgates opened. I poured out the whole story, stumbling upon the smugglers, overhearing their plans, being chased through the wilderness. To his credit, the constable took my story seriously. He immediately radioed for backup and began organizing a search of the area where I'd first encountered the smugglers. I was taken to the local clinic to be checked over while the police investigated. A few hours later, the constable returned with an update. They'd found clear evidence of a smuggling operation in the location I'd described. Hidden caches of contraband, makeshift shelters, even some discarded documents. But the smugglers themselves were long gone. The constable assured me they would continue investigating and thanked me for bringing it to their attention. He said I'd likely help them uncover a major smuggling ring operating in the highlands. I spent the next couple days recovering in the village before arranging transportation back home. The locals were incredibly kind, offering me food and a place to stay, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I ventured outside, I found myself looking over my shoulder. It's been months since that harrowing experience, but I still have nightmares about being chased through the wilderness. I've tried to convince myself that the smugglers are long gone, that they have no way of finding me. But a part of me will always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if they're out there somewhere, waiting to silence the hiker who stumbled upon their operation. I used to dream of returning to hike the highlands again someday. Now, the thought of those misty mountains fills me with dread. Some beautiful places are best admired from afar, their secrets left undisturbed. I learned that lesson the hard way. It was my third day on the trail. I had veered off the main path, wanting to explore a secluded valley I'd spotted on my topographic map. The terrain was rugged, with steep rocky slopes and dense pine forests. As I made my way down into the valley, I noticed an odd smell in the air, skunky and pungent. At first, I thought maybe it was just some strange alpine plant I wasn't familiar with. But as I pushed through a thick patch of underbrush, I suddenly found myself on the edge of a large clearing. My jaw dropped as I took in the scene before me. Row after row of marijuana plants stretched out across the hidden valley floor. This was no small operation. There had to be thousands of plants. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Who could be running such a massive illegal grow operation way out here? Before I could even think about what to do, I heard angry shouting. I spun around to see two men emerge from the trees behind me. They were pointing and yelling in Italian. Even though I couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear. I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. Pure adrenaline and fear coursed through me. Without thinking, I turned and ran back into the forest as fast as I could. I heard more shouting and the sound of people crashing through the underbrush behind me. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had no plan, no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. I ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at my face and arms. My heavy pack bounced painfully on my back, but I didn't dare stop to take it off. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes, I paused behind a large boulder to catch my breath and listen. I could still hear distant shouting and movement through the forest. They were still pursuing me. As the initial panic started to fade, I tried to think rationally about my situation. I was deep in an unfamiliar wilderness area, with unknown number of hostile people searching for me. I had limited supplies and no way to call for help. My best chance was to try to make it back to a main trail or find some kind of civilization. But I couldn't risk taking a direct route. I had to assume they knew these mountains far better than I did. I decided my safest bet was to find a stream or river and follow it downstream. It would help mask my trail and hopefully lead towards more populated areas. Plus, I could use the water to stay hydrated. I oriented myself using the sun and my compass, then set off at a fast hiking pace, keeping my ears alert for any signs of pursuit. As night started to fall, exhaustion was setting in. I hadn't dared to stop moving all day. My legs felt like jelly and my lungs burned. I needed to find somewhere to rest, but it had to be well hidden. After searching for a while, I found a small cave-like overhang formed by some fallen boulders. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I crawled inside and allowed myself to collapse. I didn't dare light a fire or use my headlamp. I choked down some trail mix and water in the darkness, straining my ears for any sound of approaching danger. Sleep was almost impossible. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves jolted me awake. I kept imagining shadowy figures lurking just outside my hiding spot. The night seemed to last forever. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I was on the move again. I stuck to my plan of following the stream downhill. The terrain was treacherous, slippery rocks, steep drop-offs, thorny bushes that tore at my clothes and skin. But I pushed on relentlessly, too afraid to stop. Around midday, I heard the distant sound of a vehicle engine. My spirits soared. Maybe I was finally nearing a road. But then dread set in as I realized the sound was coming from behind me, up the mountain. Were the marijuana growers using ATVs or trucks to search for me? I veered away from the stream and found a dense thicket to hide in, hardly daring to breathe as I listened to the engine noise draw closer. The vehicle stopped somewhere above me. I heard car doors slamming, then voices shouting back and forth in Italian. They seemed to be arguing about something. After about 15 minutes, the engine started up again, and the sound faded into the distance. I waited another half hour before cautiously emerging from my hiding spot. I don't know if they were actually looking for me or just doing something related to their grow operation. but it reinforced how much danger I was still in. I had to keep moving. The next 2 days passed in a blur of exhaustion, hunger, and constant fear. I rationed my dwindling food supply and refilled my water from the stream when I dared. At night I found precarious spots to catch a few hours of fitful sleep, wedged between boulders, curled up in hollow logs, perched in trees. My body was covered in cuts, bruises, and insect bites. My shoes were falling apart and my feet were a mess of blisters. But the fear of capture kept me going long past when I thought I'd collapse. On the morning of the 4th day since my terrifying discovery, I was trudging along in a daze when I heard the rumble of a large engine. I immediately dove for cover, certain I was about to be caught. But as I peeked out from behind a tree, I saw the most beautiful sight: a logging truck rolling down a dirt road about 100 yards away. I wanted to run out and flag it down, but caution held me back. What if the driver was somehow connected to the marijuana operation? I watched as the truck slowly made its way down the mountain. Once it was out of sight, I emerged from hiding and made my way to the road. It was rough and clearly not heavily used, but it was definitely a road. I decided to follow it downhill, figuring it had to lead somewhere eventually. I stuck to the forest alongside the road, ready to dive for cover at the first sign of any vehicles. After a few hours, I heard another engine approaching from behind. I hid behind a large tree and watched as an old pickup truck rattled into view. An elderly man was driving, peering intently at the road ahead. He looked harmless enough, and I was desperate. I made a split-second decision and stumbled out onto the road, waving my arms. The truck screeched to a halt, and the old man rolled down his window, babbling concerned-sounding Italian at me. I must have looked a fright, filthy, bloody, and wild-eyed. I tried to explain in broken Italian and English that I was lost and needed help. He seemed to understand enough and gestured for me to get in the truck. As we bounced down the mountain road, I tried to give him a sanitized version of what had happened, leaving out the part about the marijuana plantation. He nodded sympathetically and pantomimed that he was taking me to the nearest town. I finally allowed myself to relax a tiny bit, realizing I had actually escaped. The old man dropped me off at a small police station in a tiny mountain village. The officers there didn't speak much English, but I was able to convey enough of what happened for them to understand it was serious. They took my statement and assured me they would investigate. I'm not sure what ultimately came of it all. I gave my contact information to the police, but never heard anything further. Part of me wonders if the whole operation was simply abandoned once they realized it had been discovered. Or maybe corrupt officials were paid off to look the other way. All I know is that those 4 days were the most terrifying of my entire life. I still have nightmares about being chased through those mountains. It's been years, but I've never gone on a solo hike since then. Some scars fade with time, but others stay with you forever. I was so excited for our annual camping trip with my closest friends. We'd been doing this for years, always picking a new spot in the wilderness to explore and bond. This time we chose a remote area deep in the national forest, miles from civilization. There were 6 of us: myself, Jake, Chris, Mike, Olivia, and Emma. We'd all been friends since college, and I thought I knew everything about them. But that trip changed everything. The first day was perfect. We hiked into our secluded campsite, set up our tents, and spent the afternoon swimming in the nearby lake. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, drinking beers and reminiscing about old times. Jake seemed a bit quieter than usual, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I unzipped my tent, I noticed a faint glow coming from Jake's tent. Curious, I crept closer and heard him whispering urgently. At first I thought he was on the phone, but we had no cell service out here. Then I realized he was talking to himself, rehearsing something. "They won't see it coming," he muttered. "I'll take care of Chris first, then Mike. The girls will be easy after that." A chill ran down my spine. What was Jake talking about? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I listened for a few more minutes, frozen in place. Jake's whispers grew more frantic and unhinged. He mentioned weapons, alibis, disposal methods. This wasn't just idle chatter. Jake was planning to harm our friends. I retreated to my tent in a daze, unsure what to do. Should I confront Jake? Tell the others? Try to get help? We were miles from anywhere, with no way to contact the outside world. And what if I was misunderstanding the situation? Jake had been my friend for over a decade. Surely he wouldn't actually hurt us, right? I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as Jake's sinister words echoed in my head. When morning came, I studied Jake carefully over breakfast. He seemed normal on the surface, laughing and joking like always. But there was a new tension in his eyes, a darkness I'd never noticed before. As we packed up to go on a day hike, I saw Jake slip something into his backpack when he thought no one was looking. It looked like a hunting knife, much larger than what we'd need for normal camping activities. My stomach dropped. I knew I had to warn the others, but I couldn't figure out how to do it without tipping Jake off. Throughout the hike, I tried to maneuver myself between Jake and the rest of the group. Every time he got close to someone, especially Chris or Mike, my heart started racing. What if this was when he chose to strike? We stopped for lunch on a cliff overlooking a gorgeous valley. As we sat eating our sandwiches, Jake casually mentioned how easy it would be for someone to fall from this height. "You'd never find the body," he said with a strange glint in his eye. The others laughed it off, but I felt sick. On the hike back, I managed to fall into step beside Olivia. "Have you noticed anything off about Jake?" I whispered when I was sure he was out of earshot. Olivia looked confused. "What do you mean?" Before I could elaborate, Jake called out from behind us. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked, his tone light but with an edge of suspicion. "Oh, nothing," I said quickly. "Just discussing dinner plans." Jake's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push it. For the rest of the hike, he stayed unnervingly close to us. Back at camp, the tension was unbearable. I watched Jake like a hawk, noticing how he positioned himself to always have a clear view of everyone. He offered to cook dinner, insisting on preparing individual plates for each person. I saw him adding something to two of the plates when he thought no one was looking. "Wait!" I blurted out as he was about to hand the plates to Chris and Mike. Everyone turned to stare at me. I think I saw a bug land in the food," I lied lamely. Jake's face darkened for a split second before he forced a laugh. "No worries, I'll make new plates," he said, dumping the contents into the fire. The flames flared up unnaturally, confirming my worst fears about what he'd added to the food. As night fell, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Jake suggested we play a drinking game, producing a bottle of whiskey from his pack. I noticed he barely drank any himself, while encouraging the others to take big swigs. I pretended to drink, dumping my shots into the dirt when no one was looking. Around the campfire, Jake started telling a story about a group of friends on a camping trip where things went horribly wrong. The way he described the violence was chilling, full of graphic details that made my skin crawl. The others were too drunk to notice, but I saw the gleam in Jake's eyes as he spoke. He was enjoying this. "I'm not feeling well," I announced abruptly, standing up. "I think I'll turn in early." Jake's eyes locked onto mine. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Yeah, just tired," I muttered, retreating to my tent. But I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay awake, listening intently to every sound outside. Around midnight, I heard Jake get up and start rummaging through his pack. The unmistakable sound of a knife being unsheathed made my blood run cold. This was it. He was making his move. I unzipped my tent as quietly as possible, peering out into the darkness. Jake was crouched by the dead campfire, his back to me. The large hunting knife glinted in the moonlight. He was muttering to himself again, psyching himself up for what he was about to do. In that moment, I knew I had to act. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a cast-iron skillet we'd used for cooking, and crept up behind Jake. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. Just as Jake started to turn, I swung the skillet with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and Jake crumpled to the ground. The commotion woke the others. They stumbled out of their tents, confused and still half drunk. "What's going on?" Chris slurred. "Jake, he was going to—" I couldn't get the words out. I was shaking uncontrollably, the skillet still clutched in my white-knuckled grip. Olivia knelt beside Jake's unconscious form, gasping when she saw the knife. "Oh my God," she whispered. We tied Jake up using climbing ropes and took turns keeping watch through the night. When morning came, we broke camp in record time and hiked out to where we'd left our cars. The police were waiting for us, alerted by a garbled 911 call Olivia had managed to make using a solar charger and her phone. Jake was arrested and eventually convicted of attempted murder. Searches of his home and computer revealed he'd been planning this for months. He'd even taken out life insurance policies on all of us. It's been 2 years since that nightmare camping trip, but I still have trouble sleeping. I jump at every unexpected sound, and I haven't been able to go camping since. The betrayal of someone I considered a close friend has left deep scars. Sometimes I wonder if I could have seen the signs earlier, if there were red flags I missed. But mostly, I'm just grateful I woke up that first night and overheard Jake's planning. If I hadn't, I might not be here to tell this story. I've learned that you can never truly know what's in someone's heart. The person you trust most might be hiding the darkest secrets. It's a harsh lesson, but one I'll never forget. That camping trip was supposed to strengthen our friendships. Instead, it destroyed them forever and showed me the true face of betrayal. I was an avid solo camper, always seeking out remote locations to connect with nature and escape the chaos of city life. Little did I know that my latest excursion to the Badlands would thrust me into a dangerous world of corruption and crime that I never wanted to be a part of. It was a crisp autumn evening when I set up camp in a secluded area of the park. The rugged landscape of eroded buttes and spires stretched out before me, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. As darkness fell, I settled in by my small campfire, enjoying the profound silence of the wilderness. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of vehicles approaching. Confused and a bit alarmed, this area was miles from any road, I cautiously peeked out of my tent. In the distance, I could make out the headlights of several cars winding their way through a narrow passage between towering rock formations. My curiosity got the better of me. I slipped on my boots and jacket and crept closer, using the bizarre rock formations as cover. As I drew nearer, I could hear muffled voices and see flashlight beams sweeping across the dusty ground. Crouching behind a large boulder, I was shocked to recognize several of the figures gathered in the small clearing below. There was Mayor Johnson from the nearby town of Rapid City, along with 2 state senators I'd seen on the news. But they weren't alone. There were other men I didn't recognize, hard-looking guys with a distinctly criminal air about them. My blood ran cold as I realized I was witnessing some kind of illicit meeting between corrupt politicians and what appeared to be organized crime figures. Keeping absolutely still, I strained to hear their hushed conversation. "The shipment will arrive next week," one of the thuggish men was saying. "You make sure the port security looks the other way, and we'll take care of the rest." "And our cut?" Mayor Johnson asked nervously. "Don't worry," the man replied with a cold chuckle. "There's plenty to go around." I watched in horror as briefcases were exchanged, no doubt filled with bribe money and who knows what else. This was big, way bigger than small-town corruption. This was organized crime infiltrating state politics. Knowing I had to document what I was seeing somehow, I very slowly reached for my phone to try and snap a photo. But in the tense silence, the sound of my jacket rustling seemed deafening. One of the criminals whipped around, shining his flashlight directly at my hiding spot. "Hey!" Someone's up there. Panic exploded in my chest. I scrambled to my feet and took off running, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and those dangerous men as possible. I heard shouts and the sounds of pursuit behind me as I raced through the darkness. The rugged terrain that I'd found so beautiful earlier now became a deadly obstacle course. I stumbled over loose rocks, snagging my clothes on scraggly vegetation. But fear and adrenaline propelled me onward. I had one advantage. I knew this area fairly well from my previous camping trips. In the pitch black, with only starlight to see by, I was able to navigate the twisting gullies and steep inclines while my pursuers floundered. At one point, I ducked into a narrow cave opening, pressing myself against the damp rock wall and hardly daring to breathe as flashlight beams swept past the entrance. I could hear the men's angry voices echoing off the canyon walls. "Find him! He can't have gotten far. Spread out, check every cave and crevice." I waited until their voices faded before creeping back out. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually they'd find me if I remained in the area. My only hope was to make it to the nearest town and alert the authorities. The next few hours were a blur of terror and exhaustion as I picked my way through the harsh landscape. Every snapping twig or skittering pebble made me freeze in fear. The first hints of dawn were lightening the sky when I finally stumbled onto a dirt road. Utterly spent, I flagged down the first car I saw, an old pickup truck driven by a weathered-looking rancher. The kindly older man took one look at my wild eyes and torn, filthy clothes and immediately offered me a ride into town. As we bounced along the dusty road, I debated how much to tell him. Part of me was worried that the corruption might extend further than I knew. Who could I really trust? But I was desperate to tell someone what had happened. "Ran into some trouble out in the Badlands, did you?" the rancher asked, eyeing me with concern. I hesitated, then decided to confide in him. "You could say that. I saw something I shouldn't have. Corrupt politicians meeting with criminals. They chased me all night." To my immense relief, the old man didn't seem skeptical. He let out a low whistle. "Can't say I'm surprised. Lot of funny business goes on out in those remote areas. You're lucky you got away." When we reached the small town of Interior, the rancher dropped me off right at the sheriff's office. "You be careful, son," he warned as I got out. "Powerful men don't like their secrets exposed." My hands were shaking as I pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty looked up in surprise at my bedraggled appearance. "I need to report a crime," I said, my voice hoarse from the long night. "I witnessed an illegal meeting between politicians and criminals in the Badlands last night." The deputy's eyes widened. He ushered me into a back room and took my statement, his pen flying across the notepad as I recounted everything I'd seen and heard. When I finished, he sat back with a troubled expression. "This is way above my pay grade," he said. "I'm calling in the sheriff and we're going to have to notify state authorities. You've stumbled into something big here, son." The next few days passed in a whirlwind. I was interviewed by a parade of increasingly high-ranking law enforcement officials. My campsite was combed for evidence. I was placed under protective custody in case the criminals tried to silence me. To my relief, my report was taken seriously. It turned out the FBI had already been investigating this particular crime syndicate, and my eyewitness account provided the breakthrough they needed. Within weeks, arrests were being made, and the scandal was splashed across the national news. Mayor Johnson and the state senators were led away in handcuffs. The crime boss and his thugs went down in a hail of gunfire when they resisted arrest. My testimony was a key factor in the subsequent trials that exposed the full extent of the corruption. Even now, months later, I still have trouble sleeping at night. Every unexpected sound makes me jump. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that someone connected to the criminals might come after me for revenge. My love of solo camping is gone. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe alone in the wilderness again. But despite the trauma and lingering fear, I know I did the right thing. The Badlands revealed a different kind of stark, harsh reality to me that night, the ugly truth of corruption in our society. And just like the wind and water slowly erode those ancient rock formations, it takes brave people willing to stand up and speak out to wear away at the bedrock of crime and corruption in our world. I was on a solo photography trip through the Australian outback, hoping to capture the raw beauty of the landscape. Little did I know that my adventure would take a terrifying turn that I'll never forget. It was day 3 of my journey, and I had ventured deep into a remote area of the outback. The sun was beating down mercilessly as I hiked across the rugged terrain, my camera gear weighing heavily on my back. I'd been walking for hours without seeing another soul, when I noticed something odd in the distance, what looked like industrial equipment nestled between 2 rocky outcrops. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to get a closer look. As I approached, my heart started racing. Hidden from view was a massive mining operation that was clearly not supposed to be there.